Hey everyone, Wolf Lord Rho here. Today we're having a little fun, as we are asking the question, which Primarch from each side of the Heresy would you switch to the other? General spoiler warning to begin, as I'm sure we're going to be referencing events from across the Heresy, so you have been warned. But with that said, let's just jump straight in. So the Primarchs and the Heresy, a family divided, loyalist against traitor, brother against brother. Two sides forever locked against the other, their legacies defined for eternity. But if one Primarch could be switched to the other side, loyalist to traitor, and vice versa, which one would it be? Which Primarch would you choose? In trying to place personal favourites and loyalties aside, which Primarch complements the others? Who brings something perhaps the other side lacks? Well, that's what we're going to debate now. As always, this is just my opinion. Agree or disagree, drop your thoughts and own choices in the comments below. That's the beauty of having these lore discussions. We all have our own opinions and interpretations. There is no right or wrong answer. However, anyway, let's just crack on and begin with the loyalist calls. Which Primarch would complement them? Who brings something they need? Well, let's begin by reminding ourselves of just who the loyalist Primarchs were. We've got Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists, Leman Russ of the Space Wolves, Rabute Gilliman of the Ultramarines, Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels, Corax of the Raven Guard, Jagatai Khan of the White Scars, Vulcan and his Salamanders, Ferrus and the Iron Hands, and finally Sanguinius of the Blood Angels. Now for me, if I had to pick one word to sum up the loyalist Primarchs, it would be stable. And I know that comes off as a bit obvious given the degeneration and fall of the traitor Primarchs, but I'm talking more of the campaign temperament. For me, I just feel they had the edge in terms of stable campaign strategy. Gilliman, Dawn, the Lion. Really three top tier generic strategists right there. And then the wild cards, if you will. Sanguinius, Russ, Corax and Jagatai. Perhaps more specialist, aggressive in their preference, but definitely level calm temperaments. Don't make the mistake of buying into Russ's savage mask. There's a calculating mind behind it. Even Horus himself famously lamented the brothers he ended up with. And in knowing this solid base or theme of the loyalist side, I'd say there's two ways you could move forward in how best to add to them. One, you could choose to try and keep the status quo, the stability temperament, adding the best option to blend into it, to not rock the boat as it were. Or two, you could look at it and see the loyalist side could benefit from a real wild card. Not just in action, but in mindset too. That the solid loyal combination would allow them to handle having such a presence added. I think the obvious choice would have straight away been Horus, but it's called the Horus Heresy for a reason. You take Horus away and there's really no traitor calls, so I'm counting Horus out. The War Master is untouchable. It's tempting to look at Perturabo. He's an undoubted strategic powerhouse. You add him to the already strong core of the loyalists, and wow, can you imagine trying to win a war against the combined minds of Rogel Dawn, Lionel Johnson, Rabute Gilliman and Perturabo? That would be a hard task indeed. The only real problem with Perturabo was his attitude. As we discussed in possibly my favourite Primarch week ever, he really begun to unravel by the time of the Heresy. The paranoia, the grudges, viewing everything and everything as intentionally against him. Now yes, the Emperor could have helped him realise he wasn't being overlooked, being taken for granted, that he was appreciated. But that grudge with Rogel would always be there, and I just think there could be a better option. However, Perturabo is definitely a realistic contender. In terms of that wildcard element, I really love the thought of a loyalist Konrad Curze. Unfortunately, by the Heresy he was well on his way to insanity. But Konrad could truly bring something to the table. Even Russ and Jagatai wouldn't. Russ was impetuous, no doubt. Jagatai the unknown. But in terms of tactics, they had their clear preferences. Only Konrad was truly unpredictable. Sure, he's similar to Korax, both heavily reliant on the ambush and the shadows. However, Konrad was made for the extreme. He would go to the lengths that Korax never would. That any of his brothers would. You really can't overlook how good an achievement tying up the Dark Angel's Legion was. For the bulk of the Heresy, Konrad kept Lionel Johnson and his Legion out of the way. The first were by far one of the most powerful legions, and the Night Lords kept them tied up. In fact, it was only through the intervention of Corswain that Lionel Johnson wasn't killed by Curze. And he would go on to fight Guilliman and the Lions simultaneously, coming out alive. Konrad is a threat in any arena, and I really think he'd bring something none of his loyal brothers would. However, even if the Emperor could help to get him back on track, stabilise his mind, there may have been too much water passed under the bridge. His savage beatdown of Rogel had left its scars. And combine that with the similarities to Korax, it leaves me just skipping out on Curze for my real selection. The number one choice, which for me just has to be Magnus the Red. Now, I'm not one who prescribes to the notion of Magnus did nothing wrong. Magnus did a lot wrong. In his arrogance, he defied his brother's warnings. He defied his father's laws. Even for a Primarch, his arrogance was astounding. But in his heart, he was always loyal. His attempt to warn his father, despite wrongly executed, was made with the best of intentions. His two closest allies in the Council of Nicaea were Jagatai and Sanguinius, two brothers who remained on the loyal side. And even after being forced towards the traitor cause, he, or at least his shards, were instrumental in the loyalist cause, helping to return the body of Vulcan home. Magnus's heart was always with the Emperor, until events simply went too far. He's a logical choice in this regard, and he also brings something to the table none of his loyal brothers can: his psychic prowess. Magnus's legion may be small, but it is powerful. In fact, the best suited for combating the demonic forces. Having Magnus with the loyalists makes perfect sense. And I also think despite his arrogance, he would realise there are better brothers suited to running a campaign. So he would actually be one of the better brothers at cooperating or listening to Rogel. And none of that is even mentioning the fact his presence would have allowed the Emperor to leave the Golden Throne, pretty much ending the traitor hopes right there. So for me, if I had to choose one traitor Primarch to switch sides, despite the temptation for Perturabo or even Conrad, it just has to be Magnus. Now moving on to the traitor calls. Which loyal brother could help them the most? As a reminder, the traitor calls was the War Master Horus obviously, Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, Mortarion and his Death Guard, Angron and the World Eaters, Conrad and the Night Lords, Alfarius and the Alpha Legion, Lorgar of the Word Bearers, and Magnus of the Thousand Sons. I see them as quite the opposite of the loyal side, as we've said. Horus lamented the brothers he ended up with, surrounded by monsters. And though that was done for dramatic effect, I do see that reasoning within it. For all the advantages and skills of the traitor kin, they most certainly lack the stability of mind for me. Now Horus felt if he had Ferrus by his side, he could have won the war before it even begun. And the force of nature that the Gorgon is, he could well be right. But I see Ferrus as a little too Mortarion-esque for me, namely his stubbornness. With Horus becoming more and more lost to the whims of the ruinous powers, the traitor calls needed that level-headed, practical, but adaptable commander. Someone who could wage the war, the campaign the traitors needed. I'm not sure Ferrus Manus was that Primarch. Now it's tempting to say Lion L. Johnson, an undoubted master of warfare. The first would bring a devastating amount of efficient destruction to the traitor cause. But I don't see the Lion as the best option either. A little too similar to Horus in his aggressiveness. Plus, with his own communication struggles with his brothers, the very reason he most likely wasn't a viable war master, the more Horus changed, the harder the Lion would find it dealing with his other brothers. If it wasn't for Perturabo, I think the Lion would probably simply try to win it all by himself. And that would be an impossible task. Now Rogel is an option, a masterful campaign strategist in his own right. But he was perfectly poised for the Emperor's War, a defensive one, not Horus's, the aggressive. Sanguinius is a real contender for me as well, the most unifying presence of all the Primarchs outside Horus himself, and certainly no slouch as a commander in his own right. However, we've seen Mortarion certainly wasn't a fan, which I know isn't saying much coming from Mortarion, but the Death Guard were a big factor in the traitor forces. And when you combine that with the clear jealousy of Horus, fearing Chaos would prefer the Angel over him, I think it just causes too much underlying tension, which is something you never really consider when talking about Sanguinius. Even with the Angel supporting Horus, I think that jealousy would just grow and grow, festering within Horus's mind. It just wouldn't work out with what Horus had become. And so I think there's only one real obvious choice, and that is Rabute Guilliman. If Guilliman was on the traitor side, he would bring that strategic genius on a galactic level, ensuring the supply lines in a way none of his brothers could. Despite perhaps that twinge of jealousy, I think Horus would be confident Guilliman wouldn't try to overthrow him. He would be confident that the ruinous powers wouldn't desire him over himself, and so he wouldn't have that sanguineous level paranoia. With Horus at the head of the traitor crusade, and Guilliman masterminding the effort, it would be an almost perfect combination. Combine that with the Ultramarines being the largest legion, it would be a huge boost to the traitor forces, with the two largest legions being beneath the War Master's banner, the Ultramarines and the Wordbearers. Guilliman wasn't particularly liked by the traitor Primarchs. Heck, in truth, most of his brothers found him very boring. But in being united beneath Horus, with Horus's charisma to keep them in check, Guilliman really could have laid waste to much of the Imperium, and for me would have represented a bigger challenge for Dawn than even Perturabo. So, there we have it. Those are my two choices. Magnus the Red to join the loyal Primarchs, and Guilliman to join the traitors. But as always everyone, what do you think? If you had to choose one Primarch to join each side, which brothers would you choose? Do you agree with my choice of Magnus to join the Loyalists, and Rabute Guilliman to join the traitors? If yes, why, and if not, why not? As always, leave your thoughts in the comments below, I love to read them. Huge thank you to all my subscribers, your support truly means a lot to me, it really does. If you're new, please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. And if you enjoyed this particular vid, then why not drop a like on it too. With that said, I am off, and I'll see you all again real soon.